has been the most ignorant president in our history.
In our nation's history.
Our history as a nation.
When I found out about it, I didn't know that it was serious. I didn't know the extent of it, but my sister was living in New York City at the time, so there's a lot of questions, not sure what would happen if she was okay because all the cell phones were out, but it was probably, of the recent ones, the most personal.
Over 3,000 people died that day. In the years following, wars and hate have filled the gap that was left in our country. Although Osama bin Laden was tracked down and killed in 2011, Muslims still face the backlash of hate and prejudice from the people that surround them. On September 11th, 2001, it was a brisk fall morning in New York City. Nobody knew of the events that were about to take place. 4 airplanes were hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, and their actions changed thousands of lives. But first, let's go back to the Persian Gulf War. The Americans supported Israel, which was one of Afghanistan's banes of the war. The only plausible path for them was to take revenge. Facilitated by Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, 2 airplanes heading west were taken over and crashed into both World Trade Center buildings. Another was redirected into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In the last plane, the passengers were able to take over and crash the plane into a rural field in Pennsylvania. Nobody on all 4 planes survived.
In the mid-1930s, Japan was trying to expand its empire, and part of that was trying to become the most dominant Asian country in the Pacific. So they were expanding into places like Korea and China. And the United States was not particularly fond, and that's putting it lightly, I would say, of the actions of Japan. And we, as the United States, set up an embargo to try to curb some of what Japan was doing in expanding into places like China.
As I was saying, this attack was a result of increasing tension over prior years. America was unhappy with Japan's treatment of China and demonstrated this with multiple economic threats and bans on trade. Even with these inconveniences, Japan would not budge, causing even more tension and unrest. The attack on Pearl Harbor was entirely unexpected, leaving naval facilities unprepared and underprotected.
There are several connections we cannot ignore between the events that occurred at Pearl Harbor and those of November 11, 2001. First, there were several threats posed by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda prior to the 9/11 attack, just as there was built-up tension between the United States and Japan before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, Bush ignored the threats, leaving our airports lacking in security. This created a relatively easy path for the terrorists, and they were able to destroy a very devastating target, 2 towers densely filled with people. Similarly, the United States were far too confident in the fact that Hawaii was so far from Japan. Since we never considered Pearl Harbor to be a legitimate target, we left hundreds of boats and planes in one tightly packed area, again making it easy for our enemies to cause a great amount of devastation. Of course, there are parts of these 2 tragedies that don't connect, but it is important that we note the fact that they are oddly similar in many ways.
While 9/11 was relatively recent, we could write a song with the amount of rhyming events that have occurred since. One particularly prominent event would be the Boston bombing of 2013. On April 15th, the finish line of the infamous Boston Marathon was bombed by 2 brothers who clearly had political motives. 3 people were left dead, and hundreds were left with life-changing injuries. This event is so similar, yet so different to 9/11 because of how it was handled and how people have been treated since. Although the FBI caught the brothers within 5 days of the attack, it still left a backlash on the people of our nation, the victims, their families, and the Muslim Americans who were bullied and stereotyped once again. Both of these terrible tragedies sparked the never-ending questions that ask, how are we going to fix this, and whose fault is it? This long-going debate has definitely split our country and will continue to for years to come. It only goes to show that our country has yet to find a solution, otherwise taking us a few steps back, both in 2001, 2013, and even today.
Like they attacked New York or something along those lines. And I remember watching that for a little while, and then I went back and I taught, and then I went home and I was watching everything on TV, and it was like completely unbelievable. I think it was like disbelief. I think me and everyone else just thought, like, this has to be fake, because the video looked so fake. When they kept playing those videos of the plane hitting the towers, it was like, that can't be real. Like, that can't happen. And so I think at first it was just disbelief, and then it was like, just shock. I think nobody knew what to do at that point.
So, does history repeat itself? The question still remains, although some may argue either or. We tend to believe that history does mime itself. One example of this would be the Japanese internment camps that were held in the United States, and also the concentration camps held during the Holocaust in Germany. Although the concentration camps were held to much more extremes, the Japanese internments basically had similar concepts, whether the United States wanted to admit it or not. We were so caught up in explaining how bad Hitler treated the Jews, although America went and did the same thing a few years later to the Japanese.
I think it's a really kind of sad moment in U.S. history, among other sad moments. I mean, we've been wrong in lots of things. We were wrong with slavery. I mean, we're wrong with Japanese internment. We've been wrong, and you know, I think we're starting to recognize that that's okay. It's not okay that incarceration happened, but it's okay to admit that we're wrong and still be good. You know, and I think the important thing in all that is for us to learn our lessons, right? We have to learn that, like, we were hypocrites and we can't do this again.
Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany in 1933, the year marked as the official start of the Holocaust. Millions upon millions of Jews were sent to concentration camps, where they were starved, sleep-deprived, and overworked. Although some survived, a total of 6 million people died during the Holocaust. Deaths were caused by starvation, disease, or when death camps were built, gas chambers. Fueled by hate and terror of certain groups, both the Holocaust and the imprisonment of Japanese in internment camps were unprecedented and unjustified. In both events, groups of people were specifically singled out simply because they were of a different race or nationality. They were placed in internment camps where conditions were extremely poor. Hitler believed that Jews were the reason that Germany was sent into World War I, where many soldiers were killed. Japanese were feared by Americans because of Pearl Harbor. Both the Holocaust and Japanese internment camps happened out of hate and fear that history would repeat itself. They were distorted forms of precautionary measures. Both Jews and Japanese were made to feel worthless and feared. Families were pulled apart and individuals were forced to face a bleak future alone. Japanese internment camps closed the same year that the Holocaust came to an end in 1945.
I fear, maybe unfounded fears, but I do fear that the culture of our nation is almost moving backwards in that way. That, you know, it looks like some of the events that have occurred, like the Black Lives Matter and prejudice against people who are Muslim, I think that we're seeing almost like a backlash against progression, which scares me a little bit.
Abraham Lincoln introduced the 13th Amendment in 1896, abolishing slavery. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities for different races is legal. This approved the Jim Crow laws. The Niagara Movement in 1905 with W.E.B. Du Bois demanded racial equality and opposed all laws that treated blacks as different as different from others, and this led to the NAACP of 1909. Race riots and lynchings in 1919. Over 25 race riots occurred in the summer, with 38 killed in Chicago, and in the South, 70 blacks were lynched. In Little Rock Central High, the school became desegregated in 1957. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to 57, Rosa Parks started it, and it led 381 days and was organized by Martin Luther King Jr. Civil Rights Act in 1964, through a Senate filibuster, Congress passed the law forbidding racial discrimination in many areas of life, including hotels, voting, employment, and schools. The Selma March in March of 1965, King led a 54-mile march to support black voter registration. They were interviewed by Governor Wallace, and they reached Montgomery, and President Johnson addressed the nation in support of the marchers. Finally, race riots in Detroit and New York in 1967 was the worst riots in U.S. history, resulting in 43 deaths in Detroit and federal troops being called out to restore order.
What's at the heart of both of these movements is really the same. It's a group that's experiencing injustice, and it's a group of people trying to get together to really draw national attention to this. And obviously we pointed out some of the differences, but it's about raising that issue and getting people to pay attention, especially in a society that in some cases thinks racism isn't an issue anymore because we've had a black president. I think in some ways it's more important now because racism isn't always as evident. So this is a message that I think needs to get out there.
In the Black Lives Matter movement, the type of racially motivated acts are different from those committed during the Civil Rights era, but the core problem of systematic racism remains the same. Both movements impacted society in a very powerful way. They influenced the country to think about black lives in a different light and to hopefully attain equality. Both movements blew up after important court cases. The Civil Rights Movement began after Brown versus Board of Education, where it was ruled that separate but equal schooling for blacks and whites was unconstitutional. The Black Lives Matter movement began after the Trayvon Martin court hearing, where George Zimmerman was found not guilty of shooting and killing an unarmed black teen. The Civil Rights Movement was publicized on TVs and newspapers everywhere, while the Black Lives Matter movement is currently being publicized through social media and news broadcasts. While it seems like the Black Lives Matter movement brought along more police brutality than the Civil Rights Movement, both movements faced these types of hardships and losses equally.
I think who's at fault is a society that continues to allow racism and prejudice to be out there. And I don't know why we do it. I don't know why humans have this need to make other people worse somehow than they are. But I think it's a justified movement.
Sometimes we neglect to look at what the past has done, what we've done in the past to sort of shape our decisions in the future. So I guess it's interesting to learn history just because of weird stuff that happens. But I mean, if we're just learning history for that purpose, then it's not really informing our decisions. So I think we need to do a better job across the world, not just in the United States, of really taking a look at the lessons of history and how we can be looking at those similarities to avoid terrorist attacks or creating the marginalization that affects groups that really is at the source of a lot of terrorist attacks.
History. History.
History.
History. History.
History.